today's topic is talking about strength conditioning programs for gymnastics, right? Which is a little different than what we do for everybody else, because gymnastics is this like super unique or secluded sport from everywhere where their workloads are way higher, right? The sports or the movements and the demands are way more specific, and so they don't necessarily fit into the same sort of model, or at least we don't look at it and think they fit into the same model that our baseball players or our basketball players or everybody else does, right? So things we know about gymnastics to kind of get started is the workloads are almost unusually high, right? So it's not abnormal to see a lot of the athletes are homeschooled, right? They do 2-a-days. They're practicing 3 to 6 hours a day versus like the 1 to 2 that a lot of other sports are, right? As a result, we get a lot higher rate of overuse for the sport, right? Not only are they practicing way more, but their skills are so much more specific that they're doing it repetitively and way more over the course of time than you might if you're playing a sport that requires, you know, a balance of skills and then a little bit of conditioning and everything else that's more different, right? The second one is that we have super small windows of like an off season to get these adaptations or to give them a break or to do everything else, right? If you play, again, we'll keep going back, if you play basketball, you play in the winter, you have spring, summer, and fall off. So while you might play AAU or do something else, you still have way more time to kind of be a general athlete, to work on all these other things, and then you ramp back up for your season. Gymnastics is a little bit different. They practice all year, right? If anything, they get a few weeks off at one point in time, or unfortunately they have time off because they got hurt and they're forced to take the time off, right? And the third one is they have absolutely astronomically weird names for everything, which usually are named after some person. So as a strength coach or somebody that doesn't know the sport, we have no opportunity to like piece it together and figure out what's going on, right? Which kind of leads into the problem that we have is that there's a really poor understanding and a lack of communication between strength conditioning or athletic trainers or physical therapists and gymnastics, because like if you haven't been exposed to the sport, you just don't understand what they're going through, right? We all watch basketball, we watch football, we watch baseball on TV, and you understand the things going on, and most of us played them growing up, but if you didn't play gymnastics, you don't get it, right? And so then what happens is that as a result, the sport coaches decide to take over, right? They don't trust us, they don't trust strength coaches, they don't trust therapists, so they take it into their own hands and they think that they know better, and in a lot of cases they probably do because they actually know their athletes and what's going on. So what happens is the sport coaches decide they're going to be the strength coach also, right? So they do their conditioning and they do their strength work and they do it to the best of their knowledge with the information that they have. And so what happens is it ends up looking like very sport-specific movements all the time. So instead of building this robust general athlete, they do more and more and more volume and conditioning of the things that they're already doing for their sport. So rather than giving them this off-season and building them as more of an athlete, they just continue to push them further and further into this overuse and overwork position, right? So what we really need to do is that we have to figure out how we can create these networks, how we can get better communication, how we can understand what's going on so we can all work together, we can all do what we're best at, and we give better outcomes for the athletes going forward. Cool. So how do we build a good strength conditioning program for a gymnastics athlete that takes into account everything they need and everything that we want to do with them, right? So when we look at this, we say for any good program, there's kind of two pieces that stem off of it, right? We have it reduces risk of injury, right? That's an F. Okay, so we're trying to make sure that they stay healthy so they can actually do their sport going forward, right? And the second one, this is the one that we all look at and we really want, is it improves performance. So from our perspective, we see these things as kind of being one and the same, right? We know as strength coaches or as up-and-coming strength coaches and PTs that these two things work together cohesively to kind of get to the point that we're at. But for everybody else, they don't understand that. So we break it out a little bit so that they can see what's going on. So what does reducing the risk of injury look like? So for us, it's first, it means we understand the demands, right, of the sport. And the second is we take a look at what the injury rates are, or what are the common sites of injury for their sport, right? So one of the nice things now for me or for us working with Dave is that we have an opportunity to kind of like learn what those things are, aside from just, you know, watching the Olympics or watching gymnastics and trying to guess at it, right? So from kind of like a broader or more global scale for what matters to us, as far as demands of the sport, we have a few major things. We have these more dramatic or excessive range of motion demands, okay? Meaning like, you know, when we screen our athletes, we look at and we say, all right, can you get your arms overhead, right? Can you get into a lunge position really well? Well, in gymnastics, those things are all like magnified way further, right? The ranges of motion are so much more drastic than anything else we do with our athletes that it's a little different when we screen them because we're not looking for the same sorts of thing, okay? The second one is that they have this highly prevalent need for like hanging or pulling or swinging strength. This is, you know, any time that they're hanging from a bar, right? They have that overhead position, they have a ton of traction forces, but not only that, but they're having to be able to pull, they're having to be able to kip, they're having to be able to swing from that position, so it requires so much more strength than just what we might see for an athlete doing a couple reps of a pull-up, okay? And then the third one is we have this repetitive, explosive moment, right? Jumping and landing. Okay, so, you know, whether it's on floor or they're landing from some sort of routine and stuff, over and over and over again, they're having to be explosive, but they're also having to be able to absorb that and land in a good position over time, right? So when we take a second look and we say, okay, well, what are the common injuries that we're seeing for gymnasts or for these athletes when they go through it? And our common injury sites are shoulder, low back, hip, knee, and then this like foot, ankle, calf complex as a whole. Right, so pretty much everywhere. But when you think of it, right, why are all these things happening? It goes right back to exactly what the demands of the sport are, right? We have this really high rate of shoulder injury, especially for the male gymnasts, because they're having to be so strong in that position, and they're doing so much stuff swinging from bars, or whether it's on pommels or in some position that requires a ton of strength and a ton of practice and a ton of overuse. Why do we have so much low back injury? They have to get not just really strong and stable like the rest of our athletes, but they have to get into these aggressive like arch positions, right? So it's not just, you know, can I resist force? It's can I actually create positions and create force, which is a totally different sort of core demand than we're used to, right? For hip, it's, you know, which maybe is more so for the female gymnastics that we see it with, it's all the split positions that they have to get into for everything, right? And then for knees and ankles kind of combined together, a lot of it has to do with landing mechanics. Right? So these kids, you got to think they're doing 2 to 3 to 4 times more jumping and landing than any other sport that we have at a younger age because they're specializing so early. But they don't have this baseline of strength to build off of so that they can actually support that and they can tolerate it over time. Okay, so we say, we have all these demands of the sport. We have all these injuries that are coming as a direct result of a lot of the demands of the sport. So how do we combat this? Right? So when we look at improving performance for them, first one is we have to reduce their risk of injury because we have to keep them on the field. We have to keep them playing, right? So when we look at it, we say, okay, well, we have to first look at this and we have to optimize, shout out Mike Reinold for the word, their mobility. For us, is saying it's not just can they get their arms overhead, right? It's not just can they get into a split because we already know these gymnasts are all able to do that, but it's saying how are they getting there, right? So gymnastics are, from what we've seen in some of the programs, are some of the best compensators that I've seen in any sport because they know what they have to do and they've figured out time and time again how to get there by any means possible, right? So it's not just does your joint go to this position, but does it go to that position with good soft tissue length, right? And keeping the joint centrated so that when we do our stretching or our mobility or when you do your splits or something, we're not continuing to crank our joints into excessive positions that are causing these labral issues or causing these overuse issues for them. Okay. Our second one is we got to get really strong and powerful, and even more so probably the first one because especially at the age that we're getting a lot of these athletes, strength is their foundation, and strength is the thing that they're lacking the most, right? But it's saying, okay, if you're going to have all these demands on your body doing the sport, then we have to take a step back and make sure that you're prepared for it, right? We have to load you enough and we have to get you strong enough so that when you go through a season of doing this repetitively that you can actually tolerate it so that we don't tip the scales and end up with a higher risk of injury. Okay, so what does that mean? That's addressing all of our athletic qualities. Okay, so that's saying that we're gonna work on hinging movements, squatting movements, single leg stuff like your lunge, step, unilateral hinging stuff, upper body movements like horizontal pushing and pulling, okay, and then all of our core movements that we talked about already, right? So these are all generic qualities, not necessarily even taking a look yet at specific qualities for the sport. It's saying, what does an athlete or a human need to perform well, right? Starting there and then trying to build that foundation that they can grow off of, okay? And then from a explosive power standpoint, it's taking a look at the ABCs, right? So it's agility, balance, coordination for them, and then jumping and landing off 1 and 2 feet in different directions, okay? And then the last one is filling the gaps. This is basically taking a step back now, and it's what we talked about. It's saying, all right, we laid out all the things that they need. We laid out all of these athletic qualities. They have to move really, really well. They have to be strong in all these different positions. And then it's saying, all right, what we have to do is we have to do a really good job of filling the gaps in their performance, because there are some things in there that they're already super good at that we don't need to address as much, and there are some things that they don't do at all that we need to spend more and more time on. All right, so we've been fortunate enough here at Champion for the last 3 years with the help of Dave to be able to run a summer gymnastics program, right? So started with 2 or 3 kids. It's grown each year, so we have more and more. It's worked out really well because it's led by somebody that's been a gymnast and been a gymnastics coach for such a long time, and he has that trust and rapport and has understanding from one side of the fence, and then he's been able to take the knowledge that he's learned as a physical therapist and as a strength coach to apply it to that in a way that makes sense and that builds that trust and builds that connection that we talked about in the beginning that's such an issue for the sport, okay? There's kind of a few pillars that we hit, and there's a way that we go about this for all the athletes, right? The first thing we do is we screen and individualize. So first thing we do is we look at this and we say, where are you limited, right? Is there anywhere any position that you can't get into? Are there any tissues that are short or limited for you, right? Second one is, are you hypermobile somewhere? Are there any positions where your joints have more than enough range of motion and stretching isn't necessarily what you need anymore, because all we're gonna do is cause more problems, and maybe you need strength or you need stability in those positions instead, right? We screen and we individualize for them first, right? And then we focus on filling the gaps, because one of the first or one of the most important things we learned from Dave is that we're not going to be able to get into gymnastics and to build trust with them and stuff if we try to totally replace what they're already doing, or if we try to do so much that it's seen as negatively impacting what they're already doing in their practice and performance, right? So we take this minimal effective dose approach of saying, all right, how can we fill in the gaps? How can we add a little bit more that's gonna help build this foundation for them during this off-season period, right? And not try to replicate or mimic or add on top of the things that the coach is already doing, so that rather than helping build a foundation for them, that we're actually helping push them further into this overuse position that we talked about before, right? So what we do is we prioritize things like soft tissue quality, right? So for them, that means a lot of foam rolling the areas that might require foam rolling, right? So we do a lot of lat and posterior shoulder. We foam roll their whole lower half, but it's specifically adductor groups, hamstrings, quads, right? Hitting the calves and everything. We're lucky enough here that because Dave's a PT and we have this whole program, that we actually take them for a 15-minute period before, and we do a comprehensive hands-on manual therapy session, right? So for us, that's taken care of to an even greater extent, but as a gymnastics program as a whole, what we're looking for is being able to address these things, whether it's just using a foam roller or something else, okay? Our second one is building strength, right? Because we realize and we appreciate that no other athletic quality really is going to be able to be optimized, or it's going to work if they're not strong enough for it first, right? Doing a bunch of jumping and plyometric stuff isn't going to be as effective if they don't have a foundation of strength so that they can actually support themselves, they can stack their joints, they can land well, and they can produce enough force to do what they want to do well, okay? So for strength, as far as this minimal effective dose approach, the things we look at most are horizontal pulling, which are things like horizontal rows, right? Rows from rings, doing inverted rows, all these things that help to build a stronger shoulder and a stronger back, but notice it's different than the stuff that they're doing already, right? A majority of what they're doing is in the overhead position. So we say, okay, if they're doing a ton of overhead work, let's start in the horizontal plane, let's start to build a little bit more balance for them as we get going, right? Because we know, again, in their sport practice, they're doing these other things. We focus on building 3D core strength, right? Because as we said, gymnasts have some of the most impressive abs and most impressive core strength of anybody that I've seen before, right? But so much of it comes from repeatedly creating shapes or creating positions, not necessarily resisting them, okay? on top of that, so much of it comes from flexion and extension, not much of it comes from, you know, anti-lateral flexion or side bend or anti-rotation. So what we do is we take a step back and we say, okay, I know what they're going to do a ton of in the sport, right? I'm instead going to put them in this neutral position, force them to be really strong at resisting motion, whether it's plank position type stuff, right? Or dead bug work, or doing an anti-rotation press where they're resisting going different directions. So they're doing these things where they don't have an opportunity to compensate or use accessory muscles to do it, right? If they're swinging on a bar and they're trying to create a shape, they can use their lats, they can use their hip flexors and do all these other things. We want to make sure if we put them in a neutral position, are they able to actually stabilize and be strong using their core, so that when they try to do all these other things more powerfully, that they can use that strength to their advantage, okay? And then we focus on lower body strength, particularly posterior chain. And single leg. All right, we train them, like I said, we train all the movement patterns. The reason we prioritize these things is because hip extension strength and strength on one leg is the thing that we see is lacking the most, right? Whether it's for them being able to jump and go into a backflip or create a shape, right? The ability for them to extend their hips really, really powerfully and not compensate somewhere else because they don't have the strength for it is super important, right? When they're landing, I think what gymnasts are taught from a really young age, and Dave, you can kind of attest to this if this is true, is they're taught to land knees forward, really, really upright for their positions, right? So when we look back and we say, okay, well, what are these common injuries that they're having? They have issues with, you know, ankle and knee and low back to some degree. A lot of times coming from this repetitive landing in a position that, as a strength coach or from a different sport, we're taught is not the way that we're supposed to land, but they're taught it is, right? So we prioritize things that help teach them to load their posterior chain, to get their hips back a little bit more, so they land in a position that might be more advantageous to them or potentially decrease their risk of injury from overuse of that, right? Our last one, I won't even write it up on here, is that we work on enhancing gymnastics performance, right? So what that would mean for us is that comes down to more of our power development stuff, right? So that's us working on jumping and landing stuff. That's us working on med ball drills. And then any other more sport-specific strength that we do, but in a lot of cases, there's not very much of it, right? Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to be an auxiliary component to what they're already doing, right? So like I said, gymnastics don't have much of an off-season, so if we have that communication and trust, and I know, okay, you're working on these skills, you're working on strength in these positions, you're working on these different mechanics in your practice, then that's not my place to step in, right? So it's saying, okay, I know that you need to be good at these things. If you're already taking care of it, that's fine. If you're not, how can I help to add in this component? And maybe that's saying that 1 or 2 or 3 months down the road, we get to doing more sport-specific movements or strengths after we build this little bit of a foundation. But it may just be that we constantly stay in that position of trying to help and be an accessory component to it and not stepping into the sport-specific realm of things. For there, now we can talk about kind of actually constructing a program. Okay, so you guys know this a little bit. We talked about this a ton. How does our program flow, right? We start with our warm-up, right? And our warm-up now consists of any soft tissue work, any flexibility work, right? But now we know, because we screen them ahead of time, we're not just throwing flexibility work and stretches at them for the sake of doing it, right? We're saying, okay, if they're limited in this area, I'm going to give them this flexibility or mobility drill. What we find as kind of like a general thing is that the areas we tend to target more than others are the lats, right? Because they limit overhead motion for them, right? And that's at such a premium and they need that so much, but they also tend to have so much strength and so much tone in the lats that through a combination of the soft tissue and some flexibility work and a little bit of their strength work, it's something that we really try to address to optimize how well they get overhead. Okay. We focus on hip flexor, right? Because we know that if they're limited in their hip flexors, right, but they require getting into such an exaggerated hip extension position, whether it's for a split or for a jump or some other position that they're going to compensate above or below. And a lot of times that turns into them having low back issues, or if their soft tissue is too stiff, but they still try to jam into this position because they know they have to get there, then that turns into hip issues, right? Because we have joints moving instead of soft tissue moving and allowing us to be in a good position, okay? We focus on the adductor group. Which is something that Dave's put a big emphasis on, more so in the last year than even before, right? Because for anything like a split, right, or for any extended position, their adductors play a huge role in limiting or allowing that for them, right? And they're taught so much to squeeze when they're in different positions, right? And if we're taught to squeeze and we get super, super strong in the adductors and maybe not as strong in your hip abductors, and we try to go to these positions, then we can cause problems for it, right? And our last one would be kind of like this calf ankle region. Again, because this sport has so much, jumping, bounding, landing, and all these positions that they, and toe pointing as well. They're super strong, but also super stiff in that region, right? And if we know that we want them to be able to get into good landing positions and feel comfortable there, but their soft tissue is limiting them, then we're going to have more issues than good. And so we're trying to just optimize these regions for them to reduce their potential risk of injury as they go through. Cool? From there, right, so warm-up consists of soft tissue, flexibility, maybe isolated strength work for them. So if we need to work on a little bit of additional hip strength, whether it's hip extension or hip abduction work, or a little bit of shoulder or cuff strengthening, we might add that in there. But as a whole, after we get done with the warm-up, the second thing we go into is this region that we call kind of reaction and power. So reaction and power for us is everything anything that's thought of as a little bit more of like an athletic quality, right? So this is our speed, agility, balance, coordination, and power development stuff, right? For us, the two big things for the gymnasts that we look at are the ABCs, right? So our ABCs are agility, balance, coordination. Okay, so this is, how well can they stabilize on one leg, right? How well are they able to kind of change positions and stabilize as they land from there? Right? How much awareness do they have of their body when they move? Okay? And then our second one, this is kind of the bigger component, is power development, which is a massive group that we can kind of split up into, for us, first is landing, right? Can they absorb force properly? Because if they can't absorb force well, then it's really hard to produce it, or it's maybe not as much to our benefit to produce it, right? Landing, producing force, right, which would be like jumping. And then we break it out into two legs, right? One leg, and different directions. So this is saying that, not only are we going to jump straight up on two legs, right, but we want to be able to produce power going forward or laterally, or do it on one leg to be able to jump or to be able to go side to side. Right, so it's this giant broad category of the things that we expect for an athlete. And then we break it down over time to say, all right, what might be more specific, or what's our minimal effective dose for the gymnastics athlete versus a basketball athlete or a baseball player. So for strength, we look at it from a movement pattern standpoint, right? We talk about this all the time. So we have hinging, squatting, single leg, which is, lunging. Nope, lost. All right, single leg, pushing and pulling. And then this kind of category that we call everything else. So it kind of goes, but starting off, hinging movements. This is everything that includes like our deadlifts, RDLs, hip thrusts, right? Things that train posterior chain primarily more necessary maybe than quads or this forward knee position, okay? Squatting movements, oftentimes, our goblet squats or our back squats for the athletes. Single leg stuff, which is a broad category, right? That's anything from lunging to stepping, to unilateral hip extension stuff, which I know Davis talked about a ton for the gymnastics population as a good way to train the posterior chain, right? Pushing and pulling, these are our two primary upper body categories, okay? So you can break them out to be upper body, or overhead, or, sorry, vertical or horizontal, right? So for pushing, that's pressing overhead versus pressing horizontally, right? And then pulling, which we talked about, is the difference between pulling vertically, right, or pulling horizontally. And everything else, this includes all of our core stuff, right? So when we talk about building this 3D core, it starts off with our antis, right? So anti-extension, right? The ability to control extending through your core. Anti-rotation, the ability to kind of control rotation through your core. Anti-lateral flexion, the ability to control bending sideways, right? And then from there, we go even a little bit further, and it might be, you know, now we learned how to control in those, from resisting those positions. Now we might have to be able to control actually creating those positions, right? So this is a spot where we stop a lot of times with our other athletes, but with the gymnasts, we know that they have to get there, right? So they have to train it. So that might be the next step that we go into. And then the last couple of things that we add into this category would be stuff like, you know, are we doing loaded carry variations? Are we doing crawling variations, which we consider kind of core work, but other people don't think of that way. And then any isolated strength stuff or additional things, right? So if we talk about traction forces and hanging being like a really high demand for the sport, and shoulders being a really high injury rate for them, then maybe we have to do accessory cuff and shoulder strength work to kind of support that, right? If we talk about, you know, hip and knee and low back being an issue as far as injuries, right, then maybe we have to address hip extension or hip rotation strength a little bit more as an isolated piece at the end to support that. The last one, this is a piece that we've included more and more of kind of recently, is energy systems. It's not something that I'll get super specific on, but kind of the basis of it is that we try to live on the extremes, right? Because what we find is, and this is the same with every single sport, is that when you're in practice and you know you're practicing your skills or you're going through your routines and everything, nothing is hard or fast enough that it's truly training that kind of like explosive burst anaerobic quality, right? And nothing is, everything is rarely slow enough or low enough of a demand that they're truly training like aerobic capacity for that, right? So if we know that practice is always going to be in kind of that middle ground where it's kind of hard, kind of tiring, but doesn't necessarily maximize training either quality, then in our non-sport training or in our strength and conditioning, we want to try and live on those ends and try and enhance those qualities as much as we can for them, okay? So what that means for us is that we kind of stay on two ends where the easy way to describe it is we have this kind of like burst end, right? And then a kind of general work capacity. Okay, where this burst end is their ability to be super, super explosive or quick or whatever that may be for the really short period of time. Okay, so for this kind of anaerobic effect, we know that it lasts for somewhere around like 8 to 12 seconds we're able to do, okay? So we consider this be things that are about 8 to 12 seconds on and 3 to 10 times off. Meaning if I'm doing 10 seconds of work, then I'm gonna have somewhere between 30 and 100 seconds off after it, depending on how intense you're actually training it or how many reps you're doing or what level that athlete might be at, right? So what we're looking for essentially is that they have complete and full rest between reps so that they're recovered and they can give you that same sort of effort again going forward, right? On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, we have this general work capacity, which we train as something more continuous, right? So it's just something that it's a level that they can sustain at the same rate for more than 5 minutes, right? So the way we usually program it, because it comes after our strength training and we don't have time to do 30 to 60 to 90 minutes of it at once, is we say it's somewhere between 6 and 15 minutes, continuous work, and we're kind of throwing the kitchen sink at it as far as we might have them doing sleds, or we might have them doing farmer's carries or some other sort of general work that allows them to elevate their heart rate a little bit, but it's not movements that are so physically taxing on any one muscle group or anything that they can't continue to sustain it going forward. Cool, so there's no limiters within it. Now when we actually construct a program, I will kind of skip over the warm-up section of it because I think it's something that Dave talks about a lot more, and it's something that's a little bit more specific person to person. But when we're designing a program and we look at the power section, the strength section, and the energy systems training section, we'll see how we kind of break this up over the course of 2 days. Okay? So if I have 2 days training with this person, right, we already talked about we have these qualities that we want to be able to train. We want to train kind of their agility, balance, coordination. We want to be able to train power development for them, right? So the way we designed our program going forward with our athletes was we're going to do 2 kind of groupings in our power section, okay? Grouping 1 is going to start to address that kind of agility, balance, coordination, as well as a little bit of the power development, but more on single leg, right? Because for single leg training, we know that they need to have a higher degree of stability and awareness there before we can necessarily train it as like a true power tool for them, right? Because if they can't stand on one leg, they're not gonna be able to jump off it really powerfully. If they're not strong enough to stand on that one leg and jump off of it, then it's not gonna be worth anything. They'll be like a wet noodle coming off the ground. Cool, okay? So we might do something on day 1 that's like a lateral hop with an emphasis on sticking the landing. Right? So we do these all the time. We call them lateral bounds. So it's jumping to the side. Boom, I'm going to stick that landing, make sure I'm nice and stable, and I'm going to step back and I'm going to do it again. Okay, so we're building a little bit of power production, right? But more so focusing on the landing, more so focusing on the balance and the coordination of that movement. Okay? And then we might pair that with something that's not competing as a movement, right? So we might do a med ball overhead throw, right? I'll call them a slam. So now we're incorporating a little bit of upper body or total body power production stuff, where we're going from standing with this med ball, we're gonna come up overhead really high, we're gonna throw the ball down to the ground as aggressively as we can, sitting our hips back, and at the same time as we're working on this power production for their upper body, we are starting to teach them landing mechanics, because as you notice, as you come down and you throw that ball, we're shooting our hips back, we're getting into this position that we're nice and balanced, and it's gonna feed forward to when we do our power production off 2 legs training after. Right? So then our second one right after this, we might do something like a box jump. Now, we see this as being like really maybe non-specific to gymnastics, but what we're looking at here is we're training their ability to jump vertically off of 2 feet, right? And we're using the box to increase the height so that their demand on the landing isn't quite as much, right? So we already said that, you know, landings are somewhat of kind of like an overused position for the gymnast, right? This knee and ankle is something that they have a high rate of injury for, okay? One of the problems is that they don't understand landing mechanics as well. So a way that we can teach it in a less threatening state is instead of having them land back onto the ground where they have this distance that they have to travel back down to land, we teach them landing onto a box, right? So the height that they're landing onto is a little bit higher. The ground reaction force or the landing force is a little bit less, so it's a little less threatening for them, okay? And then we pair that a lot of times with something that might be kind of like an accessory thing. So oftentimes for our athletes, it's whether it's an isolated hip strengthening exercise or an isolated rotator cuff strengthening exercise, something that allows us to train an additional quality within the day or get a little extra work in that's not necessarily competing with this movement, and it's making it so that they don't have to just stand there and rest and not do anything while they're doing it. Because if you think if we have, you know, a group of 10 athletes, they're going through these groupings. If you have them do, you know, 5 box jumps and then rest for 2 minutes, then they're going to be bored, right? But if we have them do 5 box jumps and then they come off and they do clamshells or they do rotator cuff exercises, that they're actually doing something productive and they keep them moving the whole time and their attention span's a little bit better. Okay, so we tend to do isolated strength work. Okay. So for this section of the workout, these are our exercises, but then how do we kind of go about programming them, or what's the sets and reps for all of it, right? For power production stuff, what we often say is we can do it for anywhere between 2 to 5 sets of 3 to 8 reps, right? And this is broad and this is pretty general, but what happens here is, you know, 2 or 3 sets might be a good entry point for someone early on, and you might work up to 4 or 5 sets as they get more advanced with it. And this 3 to 8 reps is a range where it's not so many that they're going to get fatigued, right? It's low enough that they're fresh for every single rep, and they're able to give as much intent or as much effort into each rep as they can, right? If you imagine if we're doing box jumps, but instead of 3 to 5 or 6 reps, you decide that you want to do 20 of them, what happens by the 15th or the 20th rep, right? You're tired, you're having to tuck your feet way higher to get up onto the box, you're just worried about not clipping your toe and falling on your face when you do it, okay? So we stay in this rep range. Usually earlier on, we know that if they're not as strong or they're not as advanced or they're not as comfortable in general, then that effort's not quite as high. So we tend to start a little higher on the end of the spectrum as far as reps, and we start a little lower on the spectrum as far as sets, right? And then we go the opposite direction as they get better. Cool? Strength. For strength training, we tend to break things up into either a superset or a triset, right? Meaning we either pair 2 exercises together, like we did here, or we pair 3 together. For similar reasons as before, it gets rid of kind of the monotony of do a set, rest 2 or 3 minutes, do another set. It keeps them moving, it keeps them doing different things in between. It's also just more efficient as a use of time, but they also get a little bit of a general aerobic training effect for it, right? You imagine instead of just doing something and resting, you're constantly moving, your heart rate's constantly a little bit higher, and you might get some more of that aerobic effect that we talked about for work capacity and endurance, okay? When we design the strength training stuff, we tend to prioritize our bilateral lower body movements, right? We think that they have the best carryover, the best bang for your buck as far as training, and they're the things that we can load the most. Okay, so we'll start off our session with something like a hinge movement, right? And this could be our deadlifts, our hip thrusts, or an RDL, or some other hip dominant movement that we're able to load a little bit more that primarily trains the posterior chain in the lower body, okay? Paired with that, we'll oftentimes do something like a core exercise. So here especially we'll do something like anti-extension work, with the idea being that we're starting to train that 3D core that we talked about, right? We're hitting one of those qualities of avoiding this extension position, but also it's mimicking the trunk position that we're trying to teach them for the hinge, right? So we're doing our hinge, we're working on our deadlifts, and we want to work on being able to set your hips back really well and stay in a nice flat position and come off the ground and then use your hips effectively. Well, if in between that we come down to the ground and we do something like a dead bug that teaches you from a supine position on your back to be able to control trunk movement while we have extremity movement, then it's going to carry over a little bit better, right? So not only is it a good training effect, but it's also a good teaching tool for them, okay? Second grouping down, so if this is grouping 1, grouping 2, we'll hit some sort of single leg movement like we talked about, okay? Something like a lunge pattern, right? So lunge patterns are, us taking a step back, right? Dropping down and coming back up, or us doing a split squat and we're staying in this position and we're going down and back up. So we see this in 2 ways. We see this, one, as an opportunity to continue to train their legs to get a little bit stronger, but also what happens, especially as they progress and we start to increase ranges of motion, is that it works as a really nice way to train eccentric control and mobility through deeper hip ranges of motion, right? So you see with our gymnasts, and Dave's put up a ton of videos of this and stuff, we'll do a rear foot elevated split squat, right? So back foot up on a roller, but then we'll also put their front foot up. So when they get to their bottom position, they're not just getting to this kind of 90-degree position at the hip, they're going even further, right? So the demands on the soft tissue surrounding their hip are more, and they're able to get a better carryover to the things that they need to be able to do, like their splits, right? That they've been cranking into position for years, but now we're learning to get a little bit stronger or to increase our tissue flexibility for those positions, okay? Paired with that, we'll do something like our upper body pulling movements, right? And we'll prioritize things like horizontal pulling. We talked already about traction forces and demands are one of the big things for gymnastics, right? They have to be able to hang on, they have to be able to swing, they have to be able to kip from all these positions, okay? If we already know that that's something that they're doing a ton of in their sport, then we kind of take a step back and we say, all right, how can we build a more robust or a more balanced shoulder by training a slightly different or a similar movement pattern, right? So we train horizontal pulling to build back strength, to build shoulder strength, versus continuing to try and overdo that overhead position, right? One of the reasons that their lats and their shoulders are this injury site is that they do so much overhead pulling that their lats are almost overdeveloped, and their mid-back muscles and their cuff muscles are underdeveloped, right? So we take a step back, we work on horizontal pulling stuff as well as some isolated strength stuff for the shoulder to hopefully build balance and support the things that they're already doing in their sport, not necessarily doing a bunch of pull-ups in their training program because we're trying to mimic or prepare them for that position itself. Cool. We might work on something like their upper body pushing, right, which could come in the way of push-ups, all the way down towards overhead pressing. Right, so part of this comes down to what we find in the screen, right? If they're a little bit limited getting overhead from like a true position, then we might not press them overhead right away. If they're not limited, then we might start to press them overhead right away, right? I think that the sort of overuse of the shoulder or that position is less from pressing movement, it's more from that pulling or that hanging position. So what we'll do is we'll kind of start them from a horizontal position, right, in something like a push-up that allows for free motion of their shoulder blades and their scap. And then we'll progress into things like doing a yoga push-up, right, that takes that horizontal push and then starts to reach into that overhead position. Or we might progress to something like a landmine press, right, that's kind of like this pseudo overhead position where they're pressing up and at an angle overhead, and as they get better, they can start to lean into it more to get there. But then we might progress all the way right to doing an overhead press, right? And then you see from our guys that a lot of times we'll start them kneeling or in a position where if I'm here, I'm not able to compensate by moving through my low back or by jutting my head forward or something. So we'll force them to work on these same core principles that we talked about of maintaining a good neutral position. And now I'm gonna press all the way up overhead here and work on good full shoulder flexion and range of motion and being strong in that position, right? So I think that door's a little bit more wide open here when compared to horizontal pulling, at least early on for the athletes, or if they're also in the middle of their gymnastics training, right? As opposed to being in a total off season. And then the last thing that we'll throw in here is more core work, right? So if we talked about, we already did a little bit of anti-extension core work here. Here's where we'll throw in some sort of rotation or lateral flexion. Right, so lateral flexion being this side bend position. Okay, so these are things that they don't get trained as much. I don't think they don't get appreciated as much because you don't see them come up in the sport quite as much, right? So it's less about mimicking a sporting movement or a sporting position and more about building a strong, robust core that they can train on top of for everything else. Okay, so we might do our anti-rotation presses where they press out and they're trying to stay in a good position where a band or somebody is trying to pull them sideways or out of position. Okay, we might do side plank work. We might do unilateral carries, right, where they're walking and they're holding a load and they're working on grip strength at the same time as they're resisting this kind of side bend motion. All right, so if that's day one and we're looking to build a little bit of balance here throughout the week, then the second day we're gonna fill the gaps and we're gonna do the rest of the stuff, right? So day two, we'll go through it a little bit quicker. If we did lateral hopping onto a pad or into a stick landing or something, we might do forward hopping, right? So for us, this is something where we put in, a lot of times we'll put in hurdle hops. Right, so we notice on day one we went side to side, right? So we jump to the side, work on sticking that landing sitting into your hip. Day two, now we're gonna go forward, right? So I'm going to hop, stick that landing and sit into it. So I'm working on different positions, different angles for building that balance and that coordination on single leg stance, okay? Day one, I did med ball overhead slam. So it's this kind of overhead throwing downward motion. Day two, I'm gonna do some sort of pressing or pushing power development, right? So this could be anything from a med ball chest pass, all the way forward to something like a push press. So if you think about specific sporting demands, if they're doing, gymnastics terminology and skills are not my thing, but if they're doing like a back or front handspring or something, right? And they're actually on their hands, they're usually upside down or in that position. So if you think about it from the way we train power development, that would be us pushing or going up in the overhead motion versus straight forward, right? But based on their screen or based on a starting point, or maybe it's an off season, we want to take a step back, we might start with taking a med ball and throwing it straight forward, right? And just work on this general pushing power development. And then over time, as we progress, we might go to taking something like light dumbbells, and now we're going using the legs a little bit, and we're trying to be fast and explosive, pushing up overhead, right? So it mimics that position or the demand for them a little bit more. Cool? Our second grouping then, if we talked about box jumps over here, and this is a little bit more focused on training their landing mechanics and everything. On day 2, we might do something like a seated vertical jump, right? So whereas on this day, we're focused a little bit more on the landing, we're starting with a low box and we want to work on that position. On day 2 now, I'm starting from a seated position, from a static position, and I'm worried about training force production for them, right? So we're starting sitting down. I'm going to jump as hard as I can from that position and try to land from there. Okay, so we take kind of different emphases on this, and rather than working on, repeated bouncing or jumping around just for the sake of it or for a ton of ground contacts, we're intentionally working on improving the quality and the amount of force that they can put into the ground to jump higher and more powerfully, right? Just the same as we're training their strength on 2 legs to try and enhance their muscular strength and their force production capabilities for that, okay? And then paired with that, again, we might work on more isolated strength stuff. So if on day 1 we said, okay, I'm going to pair with this doing sideline clams with the band, and I'm going to work on a little bit of hip external rotator strength. On day 2, I might say, okay, I'm going to work on a little bit of additional rotator cuff strength. So I'm going to do a sideline dumbbell external rotation and build a little bit more shoulder strength there. Okay, so it's just balanced out throughout the week. Okay, this could be more specific based on their demands. Maybe they're coming off of a shoulder injury and you want to prioritize that on both days and you put more of that in, but this is just kind of like a general balanced approach. Then when we get into the strength stuff, if we're on day 2, if we did a hinge movement on day 1, right? On day 2, I'm going to do more of a squatting movement. Okay, so this could be a goblet squat, so you're just holding the weight out in front. Could be your back squat, some way that we're able to load the legs in a little bit more of a balanced hip and knee flexion position, right? Versus sitting back so much and focusing on primarily targeting hamstrings and glutes. We're going to use their quads a little bit more. We're going to train a position that might mimic their actual jump or their landing position a little bit more, so that they get stronger there and we build a little bit more resiliency, okay? Paired with that, again, we could train another core movement, right? So we could do anti-extension again. So if on day 1 with our deadlift movement, we trained a dead bug, right? So you're laying on your back, nice stable core, moving your limbs from there. On day 2, maybe we do the opposite and we do something like we train a bird dog. Okay, so it's the same sort of thing, but now from the hands and knees position. So again, what we're trying to work on for them is, I want to train their ability to be aware of their trunk position, right? To find what neutral feels like and to be able to move their limbs or their extremities from there, right? Because if they go into this movement and they start going out and immediately they get to part way and then they start substituting with their low back or something else, then we know we've got some sort of break in the chain. Whether it's they're truly stiff and they're unable to get to that position, and so all their life when they're having to get into that overhead position or get into that hip extended position, they've just been going here and then compensating for it somewhere else. And that starts to give us a little lead into why they have some of these overuse injuries. Or they're just not strong or aware or as comfortable using those things to get there. Right? So maybe they just didn't know that every time they did this, they were going like that. And so when we train them to be a little bit more aware of their trunk, to find and utilize their end ranges to get to those positions, then maybe as a transfer over to their sport, that allows them to optimize their positions for their sport even better, right? But from a training perspective, I like training these 2 things together because again, it works on find that neutral, find your stable trunk, and then move from there, which is exactly what we want to do for their squat, right? We want them to be able to get rock solid through their core, move through their hips and their knees and sit into that squat position and train their legs. Cool? Our second grouping down, if on this day we train something like a lunge pattern from single leg, right, which might be a little bit more quad or a little bit more knee dominant. On the other day, I want to train more of a hinge pattern from the single leg or more hip extension strength. Okay, so we tend to do a lot of hip thrusts. Okay, because we want to train their posterior chain, right? And the single leg position is a little bit easier to start with or a little bit less threatening too. but we're able to train their ability to get into an extended position, stay locked in and nice and tight, and really get strong through their hip extensors from there, okay? So through a combination of the fact that we know that hip flexors tend to be a little bit tight for them, low backs tend to be a little bit stiff and a little bit achy for them in general, by kind of training them to use something else, right, to use their glutes, their hip extensors, to be strong in that position, that we can hopefully fight and balance out some of the load or the amount of stress taken on from there, okay? If on day one we did horizontal pulling, on day two, this is where it depends a little bit more on what they're doing. We might, again, train horizontal pulling to just build more general back strength, but we may also start to introduce some vertical pulling, right? For us, a lot of times when we do this, it's not necessarily, if we go with vertical pulling, it's not necessarily in the way of doing pull-ups right away, right? Again, we're assuming that they're probably not in a complete off season. They're probably not doing no skill work themselves. So they're probably on a bar already, right? They're doing those things, they're training that with their sport, at least from what we've seen a lot of times. So what we tend to do is we take like a slightly more isolated approach, and we might do something like a pull down with the cable, right? Where we can control their position, control their posture, maybe from a half kneeling, right? We can work on pulling vertically and pulling downward, but at the same time, we can control for any accessory movement from their trunk or from their back, right? So if you picture doing pull-ups and it's really, really challenging, it's hard for you, and you get kind of this like extended position out of it, or they start to kip, or they start to use their legs and jump to get up to there, right? Instead of truly working on that full range of motion from the shoulder, if we do something like a pull down, and we can go to a kneeling or a split stance posture, we can control for trunk movement, and we can work on a full shoulder range of motion through both directions. Not only are we going to get them a little bit stronger, build some awareness for those positions, but it could also help to kind of eccentrically load the muscles and work on flexibility from that, right? So that's our kind of like minimal effective dose, step back approach to how do we train those positions without overdoing those positions for them, okay? And then our third grouping, once again, we're going to do some sort of upper body push, which usually is taking a look at, whatever we decided to do on day one, right? If we did a push-up on day one, something horizontal on the ground, then on day two, we might do something like a landmine press or an overhead press, right? Depending on where they're at with things. So we might press a landmine up at an angle, we might take a dumbbell, we might press it straight up overhead. Either way, we're trying to fill out the gaps of what we haven't trained yet, okay? And then again, this core work. And taking a look and saying, okay, if on day one I decided I was going to train anti-rotation, so I'm training my ability to resist rotating to the side, then on day two, I'm going to go and I'm going to do anti-lateral flexion. So I might do a side plank or I might do a carry, right? So we filled out, and throughout the week here with all of this stuff, we've hit every single movement pattern that we talked about is essential for our athletes or for the humans to kind of like fill in the gaps of their performance and build a foundation for them, right? We have our hinging movements, our squats, single leg stuff in multiple planes, pulling in multiple planes, pushing in multiple planes, and then kind of this robust approach to training the core in 3 dimensions for everything, okay? So then from here, how do we progress going forward? Right, so we look at this from a couple different ways that we can progress. So for the reaction power training, right, we can progress the intensity, which is kind of self-regulated by them, right? As they get comfortable with movements, they're able to work more aggressively or express a little bit more power or go more quickly with it, that it gets better in that sense. And that's when we decide to go down maybe from 6 to 8 reps of it down to 3 or 4 each set, and we do more sets of it, right? Because their quality of each movement is that much better that we want to stay away from fatigue and be able to keep training it hard, okay? We might get more sport specific for them, right? So instead of just doing a med ball overhead slam, maybe we take something that's a little bit more reactive and we throw a med ball at them to the overhead position. So they have to catch it and they have to control not overextending against it and then throw it back down, right? So it's a little more specific of a sporting movement. Or like we talked about with the horizontal stuff, we go from a horizontal chest press to doing something vertical for them, okay? For strength work, we'll go. For strength work, For our primary stuff, a lot of times what we're looking for is increasing loading, right? So if in the beginning we start in this kind of sweet spot of working around 8 to 10 or 12 rep range, right? Over time, what we want to do is we want to be able to increase their awareness of the movement, right? Start to increase their loading and get to a position where they could do something in the 3 to 6 rep range with an appropriate enough load or with enough intent that they're actually getting a training effect out of it, right? Well, I know that like our textbooks tell us that like 5 to 8 reps is ideal for strength, right? 5 to 8 reps is maybe ideal for strength, but not if you don't know how to load it well enough that you're actually getting enough motor unit recruitment to make it challenging from that position, right? So that's why we start people in this kind of middle rep range, is that they'll get a training effect out of it, they will get stronger, and over time, over a few weeks, they'll start to be able to increase their load to a point where maybe by the end of that 4 weeks, they pick a weight that they couldn't complete that 8th rep on, right? And that's when we know that they're ready to start moving down. And we start pushing them to this, 3 to 6 rep range. And they start using their loads, they start increasing loads week to week, and all of a sudden, they're able to get into a good position, right? Create enough tension and enough force that they could do 3 to 5 or 6 challenging reps for that and actually get a training effect out of it, right? So loading is one of our primary ways. And then for kind of like our accessory stuff, specificity, which could be that, we start to work into doing more overhead motions for vertical pulling stuff. We start to do more overhead pressing work. We start to do core work like Nick asked about, that's not just training resisting motion, but we start to train into those positions. So maybe we start doing something like a hollow hold or a leg lift or something that requires them to actually be able to not just hold a position but flex from there, okay? We increase range of motion. So once they've learned to kind of own a position, right, and they feel strong and they're stable there, we'll increase range of motion for them. For the gymnastics athletes, probably more than anybody else, because we know now that one of the best ways to improve range of motion in a good way is to do kind of eccentric or just slow loaded strengthening movements through those positions, right? So for them, it's not just about, being strong generally, it's about being strong in these kind of extreme positions that we talked about. So if we can increase range of motion by elevating their feet on a split squat, so they have to go to a deeper hip flexion and deeper hip extension position for that. If we start to take their deadlifts and instead of having it elevated up on a mat or using a trap bar, we start to go to a more lengthened or extreme range of motion, so that not only are they training hip extension at the top, but as they lower and they go to the bottom position, they're training eccentric hamstring length at the same time, right? So range of motion is a big one for us. One that we didn't talk a ton about was for kind of our energy system stuff. The two things that we might do is, if it's that kind of aerobic or general work capacity stuff, we might increase duration, right? So slightly increase their intensity, increase the duration of time they're doing for, and try to train their ability to sustain that for longer, so that they can get through longer practices, right? They can get through their full floor routine without being gassed by the end of it. And then for that kind of burst style stuff, it's maybe continuing to increase the intensity of it, right? So if in the beginning they're able to go at, like a 80% effort, and they can do that for 8 or 10 seconds, and they feel pretty gassed going through the rest periods of that, well, maybe we're able to just on their own, they're able to push a little bit harder for it, right? Or maybe if in the beginning we decided we were going to do that energy systems training on a bike, right, where they can just rip away on the bike and they can get their heart rate up and they can work really hard, maybe later on we start doing that with sprints, right, because it's more specific to them, it's more specific to what they have to do in their sport going forward. Do we have questions?
Do you worry that, like, by training certain movement patterns, like working on posterior chain and landing stuff like you were talking about, do you worry that that will translate poorly into performance? Because I know the way that they're graded
Sure.
isn't always moving the most efficiently. It's much for like certain things, like upright posture, like you were saying.
I think that's where the relationship and the rapport, kind of like the understanding, comes in, right? So it's us saying, I'm not trying to replace the coach. I'm not trying to replace your skill work. I'm not trying to replace the things that you're doing. All I'm doing is saying, okay, from a movement or an injury or a strength standpoint, these are things that on a foundational level seem to be our principles, right? So we're taught to land a little bit more hips back. We are taught to do movements a certain way. We're taught to do all of this stuff, right? If we can help to build them strength on a foundational level, our goal is that it transfers or helps them with their more specific skill work, right? It's similar to saying for our baseball guys, right? We do med ball throws that kind of mimic their sporting movement, like hitting, right? We do anti-rotation core work, right? It's not to say that when they hit that they're going to hold their hands down here and they're going to swing through and use mostly their hips and start from that position. It's not to say that because we do anti-rotation presses and we hold here when we resist any sort of rotation that when they swing they're supposed to stay right here and they can't rotate or turn through anything else. I think it's saying we're building a foundation for it so that it gives them more of a base to build off of when they do those things versus continuing to hammer those things into the ground over and over again and push them more into overuse for it. Does that make sense? Good question though. I think Dave deals with that all the time, right? They come in, I see with the people that come in and they have some sort of like ankle or knee injury, one of the first things that happens once they get out on the floor after he's worked on them or done some strengthening stuff with them is he starts to work on landing mechanics, right? And I think that if we can try and just push them like 1 degree in the direction that we want versus trying to overhaul what's seen as, you know, a good score for their sport, that we just give them like a greater movement library, or we give them like more opportunities to be successful. I certainly don't think it's a bad thing. I think that doing like a sumo position might be a nice way to work on strength from those lengthened positions. I think in general, our main goal with that is to train hip extension, train the posterior chain a little bit. So we tend to start in a more neutral position, and with whatever variation is like the lowest barrier to entry, so that they can learn it quick, they can be successful with it, and it's not overwhelming. I think the other thing too, because strength conditioning is like not quite the culture of gymnastics yet, every deviation from like normal makes it more scary, right? So doing something with a barbell is more scary than doing it with a kettlebell, right? They see that as more of like a heavy loading, bulking training effect or more advanced thing versus this accessory movement that might help them with their sport, right? So things that are closer to body weight or less loaded and stuff, I think are an easier barrier. And I think that teaching someone just a standard hinge from like a stacked athletic position will be a little bit easier early on than necessarily going to a really wide position and starting to do that. Same for squatting. I think squats are a little bit different too, where we think, all right, we know that, you know, a large percentage of the population is hypermobile, right? We know we're taught to move through like full ranges of motion on everything. So with a squat, we might have to kind of do the opposite, right? We might have to slow them down a ton. We might have to give them a box to go to and start to work on leg strength in a more modest range before we work on anything that's full depth or full range, because it doesn't necessarily matter for their sport.
If they are in season, what's like the max
Sure.
you would train them per week?
The kids that we have in season, we really only do once a week. I think a big part of this and why Dave's trying so hard to help make this part of the culture is that he wants to take the off-season period and be able to train 2 or 3 times a week. And, you know, instead of it being 100% gymnastics, 0% strength, or 90% gymnastics, 10% strength, take that off-season period to go closer to, you know, 50-50, 60-40, so they do a little bit of strength, where it's not more important than their skill work ever. But they do enough of it that they build a tolerance and an understanding of it and stuff, so that when you get to in season and you do it once a week, or you do it twice a week for 30 minutes instead of once or twice for 60 minutes, that it becomes more a part of a maintenance routine. And it's not something that induces a ton of soreness. It's not a novel stimulus for them. It's not overwhelmingly fatiguing. It's just trying to maintain those training effects that you gained in the off season. So when we get people that like, they're injured and they happen to come in and they're already in season, it's what's our minimal effective dose, right? So we might have started with this list of hinge, squat, push, pull, carry, all these other things. But saying, all right, how can we strip this away, do as little as possible to get the desired effect that we want, because we don't want it to take away from what they need to do. So it might be that, all right, we're not going to do any squatting movements, right? We're just going to do our deadlift, right? A little bit of core work, a little bit of horizontal pulling, and some hip extension strength, and we're going to get out of there. And we're only going to do 1 or 2 sets of everything instead of 3, right? Because it's not a building phase of the year. They're building on their sport, right? So we treat this at like a very low maintenance level.